The explosion tears through the Boeing 727's fuselage with the force of 11 pounds of dynamite packed into a briefcase and hidden under seat 15F. The blast wave travels at 26,000 feet per second, shredding metal, vaporizing seats, and instantly killing everyone within a 20-foot radius. The aircraft's structure, compromised catastrophically, begins breaking apart while still traveling at 500 miles per hour. 107 passengers, 3 crew members, all dead within 90 seconds of the detonation. Some killed by the explosion itself, others by the rapid decompression that follows. Most by the impact, when pieces of the aircraft slam into the Colombian countryside near Soacha, creating a debris field that stretches across 3 miles. Among the dead, a German businessman traveling for work, 2 American executives from a petroleum company, 47 Colombian passengers flying to Cali for business meetings or family reunions, and Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, the leading candidate in Colombia's 1990 presidential election, who Pablo Escobar had ordered, killed at any cost, using any method, accepting any level of collateral damage. Except Cesar Gaviria isn't on the plane. He canceled his reservation at the last minute, citing schedule changes, and took a different flight. The bomb that was supposed to kill 1 man instead killed 110 people, none of whom were the intended target. The single deadliest narco-terrorist attack in Colombian history, executed with precision and planning, failed completely in its primary objective, while succeeding spectacularly in demonstrating that Pablo Escobar had moved beyond traditional narco-violence into full-scale terrorism. This wasn't a drug war anymore. This was a man with $25 billion in net worth, controlling 80% of the global cocaine trade, commanding an army of sicarios willing to die on his orders, declaring war on an entire country because its government refused to abandon extradition treaties with the United States. 110 people died, not because they were involved in drug trafficking, not because they'd crossed Escobar, not because they posed any threat to his empire. They died because they boarded a flight that Pablo Escobar's intelligence network had identified as Cesar Gaviria's transportation. And Escobar's philosophy was simple. Acceptable losses in service of eliminating enemies were always acceptable. The question that haunted Colombian authorities in the aftermath wasn't how Escobar had managed to place a bomb on a commercial airliner. His organization had demonstrated repeatedly that it could penetrate any security. The question was how to respond to a criminal who'd crossed the line from organized crime into terrorism, who'd proven willing to kill hundreds of civilians to eliminate one target, who'd transformed Colombia into a war zone where nobody was safe and every flight, every bus, every public space represented a potential target. 18 months earlier, May 1988, Pablo Escobar's war against the Colombian government began long before Flight 203. But 1988 marked the escalation from strategic violence to indiscriminate terrorism. The trigger was extradition, specifically Colombia's Supreme Court decision to uphold the country's extradition treaty with the United States. Escobar had spent the 1980s building the Medellín cartel into the most profitable criminal enterprise in history. Cocaine shipments, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, flowed monthly from Colombia to the United States. The cartel controlled production, processing, transportation, and distribution. Escobar personally was worth an estimated $25 billion by 1989, making him one of the wealthiest men in the world. But wealth didn't provide protection from American law enforcement. The DEA, FBI, and U.S. Customs had been building cases against Escobar for years. Multiple federal indictments waited in American courts, charging him with drug trafficking, murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. If extradited to the United States, Escobar faced life in prison with no possibility of release, In Colombia, however, Escobar could buy protection. He'd corrupted judges, prosecutors, police officers, and politicians at every level. His philosophy was simple: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Accept bribes or accept bullets. Most people chose silver. Those who chose neither were killed as examples. But extradition threatened to circumvent that entire system. American courts couldn't be bribed. American prisons couldn't be escaped. American prosecutors couldn't be intimidated. If Colombia's extradition treaty remained in force, Escobar's empire would eventually collapse when he was arrested and shipped to the United States. So Escobar launched a campaign to eliminate extradition through a combination of legal pressure, political manipulation, and systematic terrorism. He financed political candidates who opposed extradition. He bribed legislators to vote against it. And when legal methods failed, he killed everyone involved in the process. Between 1988 and 1989, Escobar's organization assassinated 3 presidential candidates, a justice minister, dozens of judges, over 200 police officers, and an attorney general. The violence was meant to send a message. Supporting extradition meant death. Fighting the Medellín cartel meant your family would attend your funeral within weeks. Cesar Gaviria Trujillo represented everything Escobar feared. He was running for president on a platform that included maintaining extradition treaties, increasing cooperation with American law enforcement, and treating narco-trafficking as a national security threat rather than a criminal justice issue. Gaviria was intelligent, popular, and crucially, unwilling to be bought or intimidated. Escobar had tried both approaches. Gaviria had refused bribes that would have made him wealthy for life. He'd survived 2 assassination attempts, continuing his campaign despite threats that extended to his entire family. By November 1989, Escobar had concluded that Gaviria had to be eliminated before the election, using whatever method would guarantee success. The method Escobar chose was a bomb on a commercial airliner. The planning. October to November 1989. Organizing the Avianca bombing required intelligence, logistics, technical expertise, and a willingness to accept massive civilian casualties. Escobar's organization had all 4. The intelligence came from sources inside Avianca Airlines and the Colombian security apparatus. Escobar had been paying informants in both organizations for years, maintaining a network that provided advance notice of police operations, military raids, and travel plans of government officials. When Cesar Gaviria booked a seat on Avianca Flight 203 from Bogotá to Cali on November 27th, Escobar's intelligence network knew within hours. The logistics were handled by Escobar's most trusted sicarios, the young assassins from Medellín's slums who'd proven their loyalty through dozens of previous operations. Their job was to place the bomb on the aircraft without being detected, which required either bribing airport security or finding someone willing to carry a bomb onto a plane without knowing what they were carrying. The technical expertise came from Escobar's bomb makers, many of whom had been trained by foreign terrorist organizations. The Medellín cartel had established relationships with groups like the IRA, ETA, and various Middle Eastern organizations, trading cocaine for weapons and training. The bomb itself was sophisticated. 11 pounds of dynamite packed into a briefcase with a timer set to detonate 30 minutes after takeoff, long enough to ensure the plane was at cruising altitude, where the explosion would be catastrophic and survivors impossible. The acceptable casualties calculation was the simplest part. Escobar didn't care. If 100 people died to kill Cesar Gaviria, that was 100 acceptable losses. His philosophy, stated explicitly in intercepted communications, was that massive casualties would actually serve his purposes by demonstrating the government's inability to protect civilians, by creating terror that would pressure politicians to abandon extradition, by showing that Escobar's reach extended everywhere. The bomber was identified after the attack as Dandini Muñoz Mosquera, a 22-year-old sicario known as La Kika, though this identification remains disputed. What's certain is that someone connected to Escobar's organization convinced or coerced a man named Pablo Gonzalez into carrying a briefcase onto Flight 203, telling him it contained recording equipment for a business associate in Cali. Gonzalez wasn't a knowing suicide bomber. He was a dupe, manipulated into carrying explosive devices he believed was legitimate cargo. Security at El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá was supposed to scan all luggage and briefcases, but corruption and negligence meant many items passed through unchecked. The bomb made it onto the plane, was placed under seat 15F, and began counting down the moment the aircraft's wheels left the runway. November 27, 1989, 7:08 a.m. to 7:15 a.m. Flight 203 departed Bogotá at 7:08 a.m., 3 minutes late due to final boarding procedures. The Boeing 727 climbed normally, reaching its cruising altitude of 13,000 feet by 7:12 a.m. Weather conditions were clear. No mechanical issues had been reported. Everything appeared routine. At 7:13 a.m., the timer reached 0. The explosion occurred in the baggage compartment beneath the passenger cabin, directly under seat 15F. The blast tore through the aircraft's pressure hull, created a massive fireball, and initiated catastrophic structural failure. The cockpit voice recorder captured the explosion as a sharp crack, followed by rushing wind and screaming. The pilots had approximately 15 seconds to process what had happened before the aircraft broke apart. Flight data showed the plane's nose section separated first, followed by the disintegration of the main fuselage into at least 3 large pieces. Passengers in the forward section, those closest to the explosion, died instantly from blast trauma, or were killed when that section of the fuselage broke away and entered an uncontrolled spin. Passengers in the mid and rear sections survived slightly longer, experiencing rapid decompression, extreme cold, and the terror of falling from 13,000 feet in a piece of aircraft that was no longer capable of flight. The debris field stretched from Soacha to nearby mountains, with the largest pieces of wreckage impacting in agricultural areas. The main fuselage section created a crater 30 feet deep. Bodies and aircraft parts were scattered across 3 miles. The explosion had been so powerful that investigators found aircraft components embedded in the ground at depths suggesting impact velocities exceeding 500 miles per hour. Emergency response teams reached the crash site by 8 a.m. They found no survivors. The 107 passengers and 3 crew members were dead, their bodies identified through dental records, personal effects, and DNA analysis that would take weeks to complete. 7:15 a.m. to noon. The discovery. Within an hour, Colombian authorities had confirmed that Flight 203 had been destroyed by an explosion. Within 2 hours, they'd identified bomb fragments in the wreckage. Within 3 hours, intelligence agencies had concluded that the Medellín cartel was responsible. The sophistication of the bomb, the targeting of a flight carrying a presidential candidate, the timing coinciding with Escobar's campaign against extradition all pointed to his organization. But the most significant discovery came at 9:47 a.m., when investigators learned that Cesar Gaviria hadn't been on the flight. He'd canceled his reservation the previous evening, citing schedule changes that required him to remain in Bogotá. The bomb that killed 110 people had failed to kill its primary target. The realization was devastating. Every death was now unequivocally murder, without even the cold logic of assassination to justify it. These weren't collateral casualties of a targeted hit gone wrong. They were victims of terrorism, killed because they'd boarded a flight that someone in Escobar's intelligence network had identified as carrying Cesar Gaviria, and nobody in the organization had verified that information before proceeding with the attack. The Colombian government's response was immediate and furious. President Virgilio Barco declared a state of emergency, authorized military raids on Medellín cartel properties across the country, and announced that Colombia would increase cooperation with American law enforcement regardless of the political cost. The bombing had crossed a line that even Escobar's previous violence hadn't approached. This was terrorism on a scale that demanded total war in response. The aftermath. November 1989 to December 1993. The Avianca bombing marked the beginning of the end for Pablo Escobar, though it would take 4 more years and thousands more deaths before he was finally killed. The attack had achieved the opposite of Escobar's intended effect. Instead of terrorizing the government into abandoning extradition, it had united Colombian society against him. Cesar Gaviria won the 1990 presidential election and immediately intensified operations against the Medellín cartel. He created the Search Block, an elite unit specifically tasked with hunting Escobar. He authorized a controversial program that offered reduced sentences to cartel members who surrendered and provided intelligence. He maintained Colombia's extradition treaty, despite continued threats and violence. Escobar responded with more terrorism. In December 1989, less than a month after the Avianca bombing, his organization detonated a truck bomb outside the DAS, Colombian intelligence agency, headquarters in Bogotá, killing 63 people and wounding over 600. More bombings followed throughout 1990 and 1991, targeting shopping centers, newspapers, police stations, anywhere that would maximize casualties and create terror. But the strategy was failing. Every bombing united more Colombians against Escobar. Every civilian death made his position more untenable. Former allies began cooperating with authorities. Informants provided intelligence about his locations. His network, which had seemed impenetrable in the 1980s, began fragmenting under sustained pressure. In June 1991, Escobar negotiated a surrender deal that allowed him to be imprisoned in a custom-built facility called La Catedral, which he'd designed himself to be more luxury hotel than prison. The arrangement lasted 13 months before Escobar escaped in July 1992, when the government attempted to transfer him to a real prison. He spent the final 16 months of his life on the run, moving between safe houses in Medellín, communicating through couriers and radio transmissions, watching his empire collapse as former associates were arrested or killed. The Search Block, supported by American intelligence, closed in systematically. On December 2nd, 1993, Pablo Escobar was located through radio direction, finding at a safe house in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín. He attempted to escape across rooftops and was shot multiple times by Colombian special forces. He died at age 44, having caused an estimated 4,000 deaths through his campaign of narco-terrorism, including the 110 victims of Avianca Flight 203. The legacy, the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 represents the moment when drug trafficking evolved into full-scale terrorism. Before November 27, 1989, the Medellín cartel's violence had been strategic, targeting police, judges, politicians, rival traffickers. The violence was brutal, but focused on people involved, directly or indirectly, in the drug war. The Avianca bombing was different. The 110 victims weren't police or politicians or rivals. They were civilians, business people, families, students, flight crew. They died because they'd made the mistake of booking the same flight as a presidential candidate, and Pablo Escobar's philosophy was that collateral damage didn't exist. There was only the objective and acceptable losses required to achieve it. That philosophy failed. The bombing didn't kill Cesar Gaviria. It didn't prevent his election. It didn't end extradition. It didn't achieve any of Escobar's strategic objectives. What it did achieve was demonstrating the moral bankruptcy of narco-terrorism. The the futility of trying to govern through terror, and the inevitable end that awaited anyone who believed unlimited violence could substitute for political legitimacy. Cesar Gaviria served as president of Colombia from 1990 to 1994, surviving multiple additional assassination attempts. He never boarded another commercial flight during his presidency, traveling instead in military aircraft or armored convoys. But he never wavered in his commitment to fighting the cartels, maintaining extradition, and cooperating with American law enforcement. The families of Flight 203's victims received compensation from the Colombian government and Avianca Airlines, though no amount of money could address the fundamental injustice that their loved ones died in a terrorist attack that failed to kill its intended target, that every death was therefore completely meaningless, except as a demonstration of Pablo Escobar's willingness to accept unlimited civilian casualties. Avianca Flight 203's route from Bogotá to Cali continues to operate today, flown by modern aircraft with security procedures that were dramatically enhanced after the 1989 bombing. Every passenger who boards that flight is screened multiple times. Every piece of luggage is examined. Every briefcase is opened. The procedures are tedious, invasive, and absolutely necessary. The price Colombia still pays 34 years later for Pablo Escobar's decision that one presidential candidate's death was worth 110 civilian lives. The wreckage of the Boeing 727 was collected and analyzed by investigators, then mostly scrapped. A few pieces were preserved as evidence in the prosecution of cartel members involved in the bombing. Several defendants were convicted and received life sentences, though extradition to the United States meant they served their time in American prisons, where Escobar's influence couldn't reach them. The crash site near Soacha has no memorial, no marker indicating that 110 people died there on a November morning in 1989. Local residents still find small pieces of aircraft debris occasionally, fragments of metal and plastic that worked their way to the surface over decades. Each piece is a reminder of the moment when drug violence became terrorism, when Pablo Escobar's war against extradition crossed the line from criminal brutality to mass murder. The arithmetic of terror. Pablo Escobar's fundamental miscalculation with the Avianca bombing was believing that terrorism was simply violence at scale, that if smaller attacks hadn't achieved his objectives, then larger attacks would. He'd killed judges, police officers, politicians, and the violence had created fear, but not surrender. So he escalated to killing civilians, believing that if the Colombian people felt unsafe everywhere, then they'd pressure their government to abandon extradition and make peace with the cartels. But terrorism doesn't work that way. Killing 110 random civilians didn't make Colombians want peace with Escobar. It made them want him dead. Every victim of Flight 203 had family, friends, colleagues, neighbors. Thousands of people were personally affected by the bombing, and millions more identified with the victims because they understood. If Escobar was willing to bomb a commercial airliner, nowhere was safe. Any bus, any building, any public space could be next. That realization didn't create surrender. It created fury. The Colombian government's war against the Medellín cartel intensified after the Avianca bombing because public support for compromise evaporated. Before the bombing, there were politicians and citizens who argued for negotiation, for amnesty, for finding a peaceful solution to the drug war. After 110 people died on Flight 203, those voices disappeared. The only acceptable outcome became Escobar's death or capture. Escobar had bet everything on terrorism as a strategy. He lost that bet not because the violence wasn't extreme enough, but because he misunderstood the fundamental psychology of terror. People don't submit to terrorists who kill randomly. They unite against them. Every civilian death created more enemies, not more fear. By the time Flight 203 exploded over Soacha, Escobar had already lost the war. He just hadn't realized it yet. November 27, 1989. At 7:13 a.m., 110 people died because Pablo Escobar believed one man's death was worth any price, any collateral damage, any level of civilian casualties. The bomb failed to kill its target, but succeeded in demonstrating that narco-terrorism was both morally indefensible and strategically useless. 4 years later, Pablo Escobar would die on a rooftop in Medellín, shot by Colombian police, his empire destroyed, his family in hiding, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the limits of violence as a political strategy. The 110 victims of Avianca Flight 203 didn't live to see that ending. They died, believing they were simply traveling to Cali on a Monday morning, unaware they'd been designated acceptable losses in a war they hadn't volunteered to fight. That's the real legacy of November 27th, 1989. Not the violence itself, but the proof that even unlimited violence eventually fails, that terrorism creates its own defeat, and that the arithmetic of terror, trading 110 innocent lives for one political enemy, only works if you don't care about the long-term consequences of becoming the monster that everyone eventually unites to destroy.